Get out of this boardroom. Janitors don't belong here. The executives burst into laughter. The elderly black janitor quietly lowered his mop and simply nodded. But beneath his faded uniform, a small gold pin caught the light, the exact emblem printed on the Japanese company's contract. No one noticed. No one, except the CEO. Seconds later, the Japanese delegation walked in. Their chairman looked at the old janitor, then bowed deeply. The laughter disappeared. The executives suddenly realized the man they had mocked was the only person in the room who truly understood their language and the deal that could save the entire company. Stay until the end, because the next words he speaks will change everyone's life forever. Everyone mocked the black janitor in the boardroom until he spoke perfect Japanese at exactly 8:47 on a gray winter morning. The executive boardroom on the 42nd floor of Sterling Apex Tower gleamed like a stage waiting for its actors. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, downtown Chicago stretched beneath a blanket of pale snow. Cars crawled through the streets like tiny mechanical insects, their headlights cutting through the cold morning haze. Inside, however, the air carried none of winter's silence. It was thick with urgency. The polished walnut conference table reflected the glow of an enormous presentation screen displaying the logo of Nakamura Industries, one of Japan's most respected engineering conglomerates. For Halcyon Dynamics, today's meeting wasn't simply another negotiation. It was survival. If the partnership succeeded, Halcyon would gain access to Japanese manufacturing technology, stabilize its finances, and secure thousands of jobs. If it failed, the company had enough cash to survive barely 4 more months. For months, that number lived inside every executive's mind, even though no one dared say it aloud. Richard Halpern, the 62-year-old CEO, stood near the windows with his hands clasped behind his back. His tailored navy suit fit perfectly. His silver hair was immaculate. He looked like a man completely in control. Only the slight tapping of his thumb against his wedding ring betrayed the pressure building inside him. Around the table, department heads adjusted laptops, rehearsed talking points, and whispered final reminders. PowerPoint slides, financial forecasts, legal documents. Everything had been rehearsed for weeks. Everything except what would actually determine the outcome of the meeting. Near the far corner of the room, almost invisible against the dark carpet, an elderly black man slowly pushed a janitor's cart. His uniform was faded from years of washing. A blue name tag, scratched almost beyond recognition, simply read, Elias Carter. He moved quietly, methodically, without wasting a single motion. He wiped fingerprints from the glass wall, straightened a chair that sat half an inch out of alignment, collected an abandoned coffee cup, replaced a trash liner. Most of the executives never looked directly at him. To them, he blended into the furniture, like the projector, like the air conditioning, like the carpet beneath their polished Italian shoes. Bradley Whitmore glanced at his watch before sighing dramatically. Bradley was 38, vice president of international strategy, Harvard MBA, confident enough to mistake arrogance for leadership. He looked toward Elias. Can you hurry up? Elias looked up calmly. I'll be finished in a moment, sir. Bradley frowned. The Japanese delegation will be here in less than 10 minutes. I understand. I don't think you do. Bradley gestured toward the janitor's cart. We can't have them walking into our biggest boardroom and seeing someone mopping the floor. A few executives chuckled. Vanessa Cole, the company's communications director, leaned closer to Bradley. At least his uniform matches the carpet. More laughter. Not loud. Just enough. Enough for Elias to hear every word. He didn't react. He simply bent down and continued wiping away a small coffee stain near the edge of the table. 7 years. He had worked in this building for 7 years. Long enough to understand something most people never learned. The people who enjoyed humiliating others rarely expected those people to answer, because answering required being seen as an equal, and they had already decided he wasn't. As Elias gathered the cleaning cloth into a neat square, his eyes drifted toward the enormous presentation screen. A single Japanese sentence appeared beneath the company logos. Changshi de Nationalité de Tishie. Bradley stood proudly before the screen. As you can see, he told the room, our opening message translates to long-term strategy for market dominance. Several executives nodded approvingly. Elias remained perfectly still. That wasn't what it said. Not even close. The actual translation was strategic partnership built upon long-term trust. Trust, not dominance. The difference seemed small, just one word. But anyone who truly understood Japanese business culture knew those two words represented completely different philosophies. One was about conquest. The other was about mutual respect. A single mistranslation could change the emotional tone of the entire meeting before it even began. Elias considered saying something. Just one sentence. "Excuse me, I believe there's a translation error." It would have taken 5 seconds. Instead, he quietly folded the cloth. No one had asked for his opinion. Years had taught him something else. People who had already decided your value rarely welcomed correction, especially from someone holding a mop. He rolled his cart toward the exit. Just as he reached the door, Bradley called after him. "Make sure you're gone before they arrive." Elias stopped. He turned just enough to meet Bradley's eyes. "I will." Bradley smirked. "And try not to leave any footprints." The room erupted in another wave of restrained laughter. Elias simply nodded. "I'll leave the room cleaner than I found it." Then he disappeared into the hallway. The laughter faded almost immediately as Richard entered the boardroom carrying a leather portfolio. The CEO looked around. "Everyone ready?" Nervous nods answered him. Richard set the portfolio on the table. "This is the most important meeting in our company's history." No one spoke. "Nakamura Industries doesn't need us." His voice remained steady. "We need them." Silence. "If this partnership collapses, 6,000 employees will eventually pay the price." He looked directly at Bradley. "Presentation? Ready. Financials? Ready. Legal documents? Ready." Richard nodded once. "The interpreter?" Bradley's confident expression hesitated for barely a fraction of a second. "She's on her way." Richard noticed. "On her way?" "Yes." "Where exactly is she?" Bradley forced a smile. "She'll be here." Richard didn't smile back. "That wasn't my question." Before Bradley could answer, his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. His heartbeat stopped. It was the interpreter. He excused himself and stepped into the hallway. The moment he answered, he heard panic in her voice. "I'm so sorry." Bradley's stomach tightened. "Where are you?" "O'Hare Airport." "What?" "The highway is completely frozen." Bradley closed his eyes. "How long?" "I honestly don't." "No. Give me a number." "Maybe 45 minutes." 45. "Maybe an hour." The color drained from Bradley's face. "The meeting starts in 8 minutes." "I know. I was on the first flight." "I know. I'm trying." Bradley looked through the glass wall into the boardroom. Richard was watching him, waiting. Bradley lowered his voice. "You were paid $12,000 for today. I understand. I can't control the weather." Bradley ended the call without another word. For several seconds, he simply stood there, staring at his own reflection in the polished hallway window. This couldn't be happening. He took a slow breath before walking back inside. Richard looked up immediately. "Well," Bradley tried to sound casual. "Minor delay." Richard's eyes narrowed. "How minor?" "About 45 minutes." The boardroom fell silent. Someone quietly whispered, "Oh no." Richard didn't raise his voice. In many ways, that was worse. 45 minutes. Bradley nodded. Richard slowly rubbed his forehead. "The delegation arrives in less than 5. Bradley forced another smile. "The chairman speaks English." Richard looked at him for a long moment. "So do I." Another pause. "But that isn't the point." He stepped closer. "Do you know why Japanese executives often bring interpreters even when they speak fluent English?" Bradley hesitated. "No. Because important negotiations aren't about vocabulary." Richard's voice grew quieter. "They're about precision." He pointed toward the screen. "One poorly chosen word can destroy years of relationship building." Neither of them realized that the one person in the building capable of preventing exactly that disaster had just stepped into the service hallway with nothing more than a mop, a bucket, and a faded blue uniform. And within the next hour, the entire future of Halcyon Dynamics would rest in the hands of the one man nobody had bothered to truly see. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. For visitors stepped onto the executive floor. No one in the hallway needed introductions. Their reputation had arrived long before they did. Hiroshi Nakamura walked at the front of the group with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent 40 years building one of Japan's most respected manufacturing empires. He wasn't physically imposing. In fact, he stood barely 5'7". His charcoal suit was elegant but understated, And unlike nearly every executive waiting inside the boardroom, he wore no expensive watch, no flashy cuff links, and no outward display of wealth. He didn't need them. Real authority rarely advertised itself. Walking beside him was his daughter, Aiko Nakamura, the company's executive director for North America. In her mid-30s, she carried herself with remarkable composure. Every movement seemed deliberate, every glance measured. Behind them followed Kenji Mori, the company's chief legal counsel, and Takashi Endo, senior director of manufacturing operations. Richard Halpern met them at the entrance with a practiced smile. "Chairman Nakamura," he said, extending his hand. "Welcome to Halcyon Dynamics." Nakamura accepted the handshake before offering a respectful bow. "Thank you for receiving us." His English was clear, almost flawless. Yet Richard immediately noticed something. The chairman spoke slowly, not because he struggled with English, but because every word appeared carefully chosen. The introductions continued. Business cards were exchanged with both hands. Aiko noticed that only 2 executives bothered to receive the cards properly. The others casually slipped them into jacket pockets after a quick glance. A tiny detail, almost invisible. Yet in Japanese business culture, tiny details often carried enormous meaning. Everyone took their seats. Coffee was poured. Folders were opened. For a brief moment, the room settled into polite silence. Bradley stood confidently beside the presentation screen. He had rehearsed this opening dozens of times. He smiled. Then he spoke. "Hajimashite. So far, so good." Aiko gave a polite nod. Bradley continued. "Kiwa, anata no kaisha wa sifuku shimasu." The room became perfectly still. Richard blinked. He didn't understand Japanese. Neither did anyone else on Halcyon's side. But he immediately noticed something had changed. Aiko's smile disappeared. Kenji slowly lowered his pen onto the table. Takashi looked down without saying a word. Chairman Nakamura remained expressionless. Bradley, oblivious, smiled even wider. He believed he had just said, "It is an honor to build our future together." What he had actually said was much closer to, "Today, we will conquer your company." Not partner. Not cooperate. Conquer. The difference was devastating. After several long seconds, Aiko spoke. "Perhaps," she said gently, "we should continue in English." Richard forced a laugh. "Of course." Bradley quickly clicked to the first slide. The Japanese sentence Elias had noticed earlier filled the screen. Bradley pointed confidently toward it. "Our vision," he announced, "is to establish long-term market dominance together." Chairman Nakamura looked first at the sentence, then at Bradley, finally back at Richard. "Dominance." Richard answered before thinking. "Yes, leadership." Aiko quietly exchanged a glance with her father. Bradley continued. "In every successful partnership, someone must lead." Richard felt his stomach tighten. Bradley wasn't following the script anymore. "We believe Halcyon's experience in North America naturally positions us to guide the joint venture." Nobody on the Japanese side interrupted him, which somehow made it worse. Silence could be polite. It could also be dangerous. Bradley continued speaking. "Our manufacturing model is extremely aggressive." Click. "Our restructuring strategy eliminates unnecessary emotional attachment." Click. "We believe efficiency should always outweigh tradition." Click. "Our objective is complete operational control during the first 18 months. Richard wanted to stop him, but interrupting your own executive in front of potential partners projected weakness. So he waited. Every additional sentence made things worse. Finally, Chairman Nakamura folded his hands together. He spoke quietly in Japanese. A long sentence. Calm. Measured. No anger. No raised voice. Just disappointment. Bradley looked toward Aiko. "What did he say?" Aiko hesitated. "My father says." She chose her English carefully. "A bridge cannot be built if one side believes it owns the river." The room fell silent again. Richard leaned forward. "Chairman Nakamura, I assure you, mutual respect is very important to us." Nakamura looked toward the presentation screen. "Then perhaps your presentation says something different." Richard glanced at Bradley. Bradley's confidence had begun to crack. "It may simply be a cultural misunderstanding." Aiko smiled politely. "Sometimes." She paused. "But sometimes words reveal what people truly believe." Nobody answered. Richard gestured toward the financial slides. "Perhaps we should discuss the investment structure." The meeting moved forward, at least on the surface. Yet something fundamental had shifted. The warmth that had existed during introductions had quietly vanished. Questions became shorter. Answers became colder. Every sentence sounded increasingly formal. Every smile appeared increasingly forced. 20 minutes later, Bradley reached the section discussing manufacturing. As part of our restructuring proposal, he said, we recommend closing Nakamura's Nagoya facility within 18 months. Takashi slowly looked up. The Nagoya plant has operated continuously since 1979. Bradley nodded. Exactly. That is why modernization is overdue. Aiko tilted her head slightly. Do you know how many families have worked there across 3 generations? Bradley shrugged. We're discussing manufacturing efficiency. We are discussing people. They're employees. They're both. Bradley smiled as though explaining something obvious. Business decisions can't be emotional. Chairman Nakamura finally spoke. This time his Japanese came faster. Longer. His voice remained calm. Yet something inside it had hardened. When he finished, Aiko translated. My father says. She hesitated. Someone who cannot understand loyalty will never understand the true value of a company. Bradley leaned back confidently. Loyalty doesn't improve quarterly earnings. Richard closed his eyes for one painful second. Too late. Much too late. Chairman Nakamura quietly pushed back his chair. The sound echoed through the boardroom. Kenji closed his notebook. Takashi gathered his documents. Aiko slipped her tablet into her leather portfolio. No one rushed. No one appeared angry. That somehow made the moment even heavier. Richard immediately stood. Chairman Nakamura. The older man looked at him. I believe. Richard searched desperately for the right words. Perhaps we've gotten off to a difficult start. Nakamura nodded once. I agree. I hope we can continue. The chairman looked toward the windows overlooking Chicago, then back at Richard. I think. He spoke in English now. We have already learned what we came here to learn. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. No, not yet. Not like this. 6,000 employees. 30 years of work. Everything couldn't end after 30 minutes. Bradley suddenly spoke. Chairman Nakamura, perhaps we're overreacting. Aiko looked directly at him. My father has spent 43 years building relationships. Her voice remained perfectly calm. He does not overreact. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The meeting was over. Or at least, it should have been. At that exact moment, the boardroom door quietly opened. Elias Carter stepped inside. He wasn't looking at anyone. His attention was fixed on a small puddle of melted snow near the entrance where one of the visitors had tracked moisture across the polished floor. He carried nothing but a folded microfiber cloth. Bradley spun around. What are you doing? Elias looked up. There is water on the floor. We're in the middle of a meeting. I noticed. Then get out. Elias glanced toward the puddle. Someone could slip. I said leave. It will only take a moment. Bradley stepped toward him. No one asked you. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. Vanessa whispered under her breath. Incredible timing. Another nervous laugh floated around the table. Bradley pointed toward the hallway. You don't seem to understand where you are. Elias remained completely still. I understand perfectly. No. Bradley shook his head. You really don't. He gestured toward the Japanese delegation. This meeting is worth nearly $2 billion. Elias nodded. I know. Bradley laughed sarcastically. Oh, you know. Yes. And you're worried about a puddle? Elias looked down at the floor. People have fallen over. Much smaller things. Bradley sighed loudly. Unbelievable. He pointed toward the door once more. Just go clean somewhere else. Elias bent down anyway. He quietly wiped away the water, folded the cloth, stood, prepared to leave. Behind him, Chairman Nakamura watched every second without saying a word. Then, just before Elias reached the doorway, the chairman spoke softly in Japanese. No one on Halcyon side understood. Aiko opened her mouth to translate. But before she could speak, Elias stopped walking. Slowly, he turned around. He faced Chairman Nakamura. Then, with the effortless grace of someone who had spent years immersed in Japanese culture, he bowed respectfully. When he spoke, the room froze. His Japanese was flawless, elegant, natural. The honorifics were perfect. Even his Kyoto accent carried subtle traces of Kansai pronunciation. Odsharitongdi desu. Shikashi akageneru kototo enroi koto watanide wa arimase. For the first time since entering the building, Chairman Nakamura's expression changed. His eyes widened. Aiko stared in complete disbelief. Kenji's pen slipped from his fingers onto the table. Takashi leaned forward as if he had just seen a ghost. Bradley's mouth slowly fell open. Nobody inside the boardroom moved. Nobody even remembered to breathe. The elderly black janitor standing beside the door had just replied to one of Japan's most respected business leaders. In impeccable Japanese. Chairman Nakamura studied Elias for several long seconds. Then, in Japanese, he asked, "Where did you learn to speak like that?" Elias answered without hesitation. "At the University of Michigan first, later in Osaka, then Kyoto." His tone was calm, almost conversational, but every syllable carried the ease of long familiarity. Aiko glanced at her father. Takashi continued staring. "What did he say?" Richard asked. No one answered immediately. Aiko finally turned toward him. "My father asked where Mr. Carter learned Japanese." Richard looked at Elias as though seeing him for the first time. "And he said he studied in Michigan, then lived in Osaka and Kyoto." Bradley let out a disbelieving laugh. "You lived in Japan?" Elias turned toward him. "For almost 18 years. The room went silent again. Chairman Nakamura spoke once more. "What work did you do there?" Elias replied in Japanese. "I taught supply chain management and organizational culture. Later, I advised manufacturing companies undergoing restructuring." Takashi's eyes widened. He stepped closer. "Your full name?" "Elias Nathaniel Carter." Takashi inhaled sharply. "Carter-sensei?" Elias looked at him carefully. Recognition slowly appeared in his face. "Endo-san." Takashi immediately bowed. Not the small, polite bow used during introductions. A deep bow. A bow of respect. Every executive on Halcyon's side stared in confusion. Takashi spoke rapidly to Chairman Nakamura, his voice suddenly animated. Aiko listened, then translated. "Mr. Endo says Mr. Carter worked with a regional manufacturing initiative in Kansai nearly 20 years ago." She looked at Elias. "He says your system helped save a precision components factory without mass layoffs." Richard's gaze moved from Elias's uniform to Takashi's bow and back again. "You were a professor?" "Visiting associate professor," Elias said. "And a business consultant?" "For a period of time." Bradley folded his arms. The shock on his face was already hardening into suspicion. "If you were such an accomplished consultant, why are you working as a janitor?" The question landed badly. Even Vanessa looked uncomfortable. Elias did not appear offended. Perhaps because he had heard versions of the same question many times. Or perhaps because, long ago, he had stopped expecting curiosity to arrive without judgment. He looked at Bradley. "Because life does not always move in a straight line." Bradley gave a short laugh. "That is not much of an answer." "Bradley," Richard warned. But Elias raised one hand slightly. "It is all right." He placed the folded cloth on the edge of his cart. "My wife became ill." The room changed. Not dramatically. No one gasped. No music swelled. But the sharpness in the air softened. "She had pancreatic cancer," Elias continued. "By the time it was discovered, the disease had already spread." Aiko lowered her eyes. "I am sorry. Thank you. We returned to the United States so she could be near her family. I left my position in Japan to care for her." He paused. The snow outside drifted silently against the windows. Treatment lasted 18 months. No one interrupted. Insurance covered some of it. Not all. We sold our house. Then our second car. Then nearly everything else that could be sold. Richard slowly sat down. Elias continued in the same measured tone. "My wife died on a Tuesday morning in March." The simplicity of the sentence made it heavier. I had spent almost 2 years outside the academic world. My professional relationships in Japan had weakened. By the time I was ready to work again, I was in my mid-50s, carrying medical debt and a resume with a long gap. Bradley looked away. "I applied to universities, consulting firms, manufacturing companies. Some said my experience was outdated. Some said I was overqualified. Others did not respond." Richard asked, "And that brought you here?" "I first applied for a facilities management position." "What happened?" "They said I lacked the right kind of experience." A quiet, humorless smile touched Elias's face. The cleaning department was hiring. No one knew what to say. Bradley broke the silence. "But someone with your education could have found something else." Elias turned toward him. "Have you ever walked into an interview wearing a suit you bought 10 years earlier because every dollar you had went toward keeping someone alive. Bradley said nothing. Have you ever tried to explain an 18-month gap in employment without turning the person you loved into a professional inconvenience? Still nothing. Have you ever watched someone decide your value before you finished introducing yourself? Bradley's arms slowly dropped to his sides. Elias looked around the room. Do not mistake the fact that a door has always opened for you as proof that locked doors do not exist. The words remained in the air. Richard's eyes fell to the table. Vanessa pressed her lips together. Chairman Nakamura spoke in Japanese. Honest work does not reduce a person's dignity. Elias translated for the room. Then he responded in Japanese. But the way others treat that work often reveals their own. Nakamura nodded. Richard stood. There was no trace of executive performance in his posture now. No rehearsed confidence. Only desperation and something that looked like shame. Mr. Carter, Elias waited. Would you help us continue this meeting? Bradley turned sharply. Richard, the CEO raised one hand. Bradley stopped. Richard looked directly at Elias. Please. The word was small, but everyone heard it. Elias glanced toward the Japanese delegation. Chairman Nakamura had not yet left. Neither had Aiko, Kenji, or Takashi. What exactly are you asking me to do? Elias said. Interpret. Bradley shook his head. We cannot allow a member of the cleaning staff to participate in a legal negotiation. Kenji answered before Richard could. I believe Mr. Carter has demonstrated more understanding of this negotiation than most people who have spoken so far. Bradley's face tightened. Richard ignored him. Not only interpret, he said. Help us understand where this went wrong. Elias looked at the presentation screen. The words about trust still glowed behind Bradley's abandoned laptop. The problem is larger than translation. Richard frowned. What do you mean? The Japanese title on your presentation says this partnership should be built on long-term trust. Elias pointed toward the screen. But every proposal presented this morning has emphasized control, dominance, speed, and cost reduction. Bradley stepped forward. That is standard business language. Standard for whom? Bradley did not answer. Elias continued. You are asking Nakamura Industries to share technology they have spent decades developing. In return, your first message was that Halcyon intends to conquer them. I mispronounced a sentence. Yes. Elias's voice remained calm. But after the mistake, your attitude delivered the same message. Bradley flushed. Richard glanced toward Chairman Nakamura. Could you tell him that was not our intention? I can tell him what you say. Elias looked at Richard. I cannot tell him what you mean unless you decide that first. Richard exhaled. Chairman Nakamura stepped back toward the table. He spoke to Elias in Japanese. 15 minutes. Elias nodded. Then he turned to Richard. He is willing to sit down for 15 more minutes. Richard immediately gestured toward the chairs. Of course. Everyone returned to the table. Elias remained standing. Bradley opened the presentation again. Elias reached over and switched off the screen. The room dimmed. Bradley stared at him. What are you doing? Removing the part that is preventing people from speaking honestly. The presentation has 63 slides. That is another problem. Aiko almost smiled. Elias took a blank sheet of paper from the legal pad near Richard and placed it in the center of the table. He picked up a pen. Before we discuss factories, investment percentages, patents, or control, each side needs to answer one question. Richard leaned forward. What question? Why do you want this partnership? Bradley answered immediately. To increase market share. Elias shook his head. That is an outcome. Then profitability. Another outcome. Bradley's jaw tightened. What kind of answer are you looking for? The honest one. Elias looked at Richard. Why does Halcyon need Nakamura? Richard hesitated. He glanced at his executives. No one helped him. Finally, he spoke. Our manufacturing technology is falling behind. Bradley looked uncomfortable. Richard continued. We have strong distribution in North America, good customer relationships, experienced sales teams. But our production systems are aging, and our newest medical device line has failed quality testing twice. Elias wrote as Richard spoke. If we do not modernize, we will lose our largest contracts within 2 years. Elias translated into Japanese. Chairman Nakamura listened without interruption. Then Elias turned toward him. Why does Nakamura need Halcyon? The chairman answered slowly. Nakamura has excellent technology, but limited access to the North American market. We understand engineering. Halcyon understands American hospitals, regulators, and buyers. He paused. We want growth, but not at the cost of identity. Elias translated. Then he wrote 2 statements on the page. Halcyon needs technology to survive. Nakamura needs market access to grow without losing its identity. He placed the pen down. This is where the negotiation should have begun. Aiko studied the page. Richard nodded slowly. Bradley remained silent. Elias looked toward Takashi. The Nagoya facility. Takashi straightened. What is its strongest capability? Takashi answered in Japanese. Elias translated. They have Nakamura's most experienced technicians in microtolerance control. Richard's head turned toward his chief engineering officer. What is the biggest weakness in our new medical device line? The engineer cleared his throat. Precision variance. How serious? We are above acceptable failure thresholds. Elias looked around the table. Then why close the facility that possesses the exact knowledge Halcyon lacks? Bradley spoke. Because the plant is expensive. Expensive compared to what? Mexico. Labor cost is lower in Mexico, Elias said. That does not mean total value is lower in Nagoya. He looked at Takashi. How many senior technicians have more than 20 years of experience? Takashi calculated. Approximately 70. And how long would it take to recreate that knowledge elsewhere? Takashi exchanged a few words with Aiko. Then he answered in English. Perhaps 10 years. Elias turned to Bradley. Your restructuring proposal treats those 70 people as labor expense. He pointed at the engineering officer. Halcyon's quality failures prove they may actually be intellectual capital. The chief financial officer leaned forward. What are you proposing? Do not keep Nagoya as a high-volume production facility. Elias drew 3 boxes on the paper. Convert it into a training, quality control, and advanced engineering center. Move some volume manufacturing to Mexico if the numbers justify it. But preserve the knowledge in Japan and use it to train the new operation. Takashi began speaking quickly with Chairman Nakamura. Aiko joined them. For the first time all morning, their conversations sounded energetic rather than defensive. Richard looked at his financial officer. Could that work? The man studied the drawing. We would need real numbers. Obviously, but in principle, he nodded. It could reduce labor costs without destroying technical capacity. Aiko turned back toward the table. My father says Nakamura would consider such a model. Richard looked at Elias. The meeting had been dead 10 minutes earlier. Now it was breathing again. Bradley glanced at the clock. The 15 minutes were almost over. Chairman Nakamura did not stand. Instead, he opened his notebook. Let us discuss governance, he said. The meeting continued. At first, everyone still spoke cautiously, but the rhythm gradually changed. Elias interpreted each sentence, though his role quickly became more than translation. When Richard said, Halcyon requires operational control, Elias did not immediately repeat the phrase in Japanese. He turned to Richard. Do you require control, or do you require clear decision-making authority? Richard frowned. Is there a difference? A large one. He considered the question. Clear authority. Shared or unilateral? Richard glanced at Chairman Nakamura. Shared, with defined responsibilities. Only then did Elias translate. Later, Chairman Nakamura used a Japanese phrase that could easily have sounded like criticism in English. Instead of translating it literally, Elias explained the intention. He is not saying Halcyon is reckless. He is saying your company tends to prioritize speed over durability. Bradley leaned back. That sounds like the same thing. It is not. Elias turned toward him. One attacks character. The other identifies a management pattern. Aiko nodded. Exactly. Each time Elias paused, clarified, or reframed, another layer of hostility fell away. The discussion became less about who would win and more about what each side feared losing. Halcyon feared extinction. Nakamura feared exploitation. Both had disguised fear as strength. Once that became visible, the negotiation changed. Yet one issue remained. Money. Aiko opened a financial summary. How much capital will Halcyon contribute during the first 12 months? Richard glanced toward his chief financial officer. We have several financing options. Aiko waited. What amount? That depends on the structure of the agreement. Elias did not translate. Richard looked at him. Why did you stop? Because you did not answer. That is not your concern. Right now, clarity is my concern. Richard's expression hardened. I am the CEO of this company. and they are asking how much cash your company can contribute. That information is confidential. Elias looked toward the Japanese delegation. They will learn during due diligence. Bradley interrupted. This is completely inappropriate. Elias ignored him. If they discover the truth later, the question will no longer be whether Halcyon is financially weak. He looked directly at Richard. The question will be why you try to hide it. Richard's face went still. Aiko closed her folder. Kenji spoke in English. We are already aware that Halcyon is under severe liquidity pressure. The chief financial officer looked alarmed. How? Supplier reports. Credit movements. Payment delays. Kenji folded his hands. Financial stress leaves evidence. Richard slowly sat back. Aiko continued. We did not come here expecting strength. Richard looked at her. Then why did you come? To determine whether your leadership could be honest under pressure. No one moved. The meaning was obvious. The meeting had been a test from the beginning. Not of numbers. Of character. And Halcyon had nearly failed. Elias looked at Richard. You do not need to appear invulnerable. His voice was quiet. You need to appear trustworthy. Richard stared down at the blank sheet of paper. For years, he had built his leadership style around never revealing weakness. Investors wanted confidence. Employees wanted certainty. Competitors watched for fear. He had learned to speak in statements rather than questions. To enter rooms with answers even when he had none. Now the entire future of his company seemed to depend on doing the one thing he had spent decades avoiding. Telling the truth. Richard stood and walked toward the windows. Chicago stretched beneath him. 42 floors below, people moved through the streets without knowing 6,000 jobs might disappear before spring. He thought of the factory workers in Ohio, the warehouse teams in Pennsylvania, the engineers in Texas, the administrative staff in Chicago. Names he did not know. Mortgages he had never seen. Children whose lives could change because of what happened inside this room. When Richard turned back, the performance was gone. Halcyon has enough available cash to operate for approximately 4 more months at the current rate. The sentence stunned his own executives. Bradley looked at him in disbelief. Richard continued. Without new investment or a major agreement, we will be forced to close at least 2 American facilities. Aiko asked, how many jobs? Approximately 6,000. Elias translated. Chairman Nakamura listened. His face remained unreadable. Then he asked, why did you not say this at the beginning? Richard answered without waiting for Elias. Because I believe that if you knew how badly we needed the agreement, you would control the negotiation. Elias translated. Nakamura responded. And you believed hiding the truth would create trust? Richard shook his head. No, a long pause followed. No, he repeated. I see that now. Chairman Nakamura studied him. Then he closed the notebook in front of him. Richard's heart sank. But the chairman did not stand. Instead, he leaned forward. Now, he said, we can begin the real meeting. The interpreter arrived at 11:26. She entered the boardroom breathless, snow still melting on the shoulders of her coat. I am so sorry. Nobody blamed her. By then, the negotiation had entered a detailed discussion of ownership structure, regional responsibilities, and intellectual property safeguards. Richard introduced her to the room. This is Ms. Sato. Then he gestured toward Elias. Mr. Carter has been assisting us. Ms. Sato looked at his uniform, then at the pages of notes in front of him. You are also an interpreter? Not professionally, Elias said. Aiko smiled. Today, he is much more than that. Bradley heard the sentence. He lowered his eyes. For the rest of the meeting, Ms. Sato handled formal interpretation, especially during legal and technical discussion. Yet Chairman Nakamura continued addressing important questions to Elias. Not because Elias held a title. Not because he represented Halcyon. Because both sides trusted him. That trust changed the balance of the room. The most powerful voice no longer belonged to the person sitting at the head of the table. It belonged to the man who had spent the morning being treated like part of the furniture. During a brief lunch break, Elias stepped into the hallway. He had barely reached the windows when Bradley followed him. What exactly are you doing? Elias turned. I am getting water. You know what I mean. I am afraid I do not. Bradley lowered his voice. You walk in there, speak Japanese, and suddenly everyone treats you like some kind of hero. Elias waited. What do you want? Want? A promotion? Money? My job. Elias placed his paper cup on the windowsill. I do not want your job. You have made me look incompetent. I did not make you do anything. Bradley's jaw tightened. You embarrassed me. No, Elias's voice remained steady. You embarrassed a visiting delegation. You dismissed their values, insulted their employees, and spoke to me as if I were beneath basic courtesy. Bradley crossed his arms. So this is revenge. No, what is it then? A chance for you to understand what happened. Bradley laughed bitterly. I understand. You were secretly overqualified. Elias shook his head. That is still not the lesson. Then explain it. You saw my uniform and decided you knew everything worth knowing about me. Bradley looked away. You never asked where I came from, what I had done, what I understood. Elias picked up his cup. But even that is not the deepest problem. Bradley looked back. The deepest problem is that you believe people deserve dignity only after they prove they are exceptional. That is not what I believe. It is what you demonstrated. Bradley opened his mouth. Elias continued before he could speak. You were respectful to Chairman Nakamura because you knew he had power. He pointed through the glass wall toward the boardroom. You were respectful to Richard because he could affect your career. Then he pointed to his own uniform. You mocked me because you believed I could do nothing for you. Bradley's face tightened. Are you saying this is about race? Race is part of it. Elias spoke without anger. So is age, class, job, title, clothing. But beneath all of them is the same habit. What habit? Deciding who matters based on what they can give you. Bradley said nothing. Elias turned toward the window. The true test of power is not how you treat people who can help you. His reflection looked back from the glass. It is how you treat people you believe cannot. Bradley remained in the hallway long after Elias returned to the meeting. By late afternoon, both sides had agreed to the framework of a deal. Nakamura Industries would make an initial investment of $420 million. The Nagoya facility would remain open and be transformed into a global center for advanced engineering, training, and quality control. Some high-volume production would expand in Mexico, but Japanese technicians would design the process, train the teams, and oversee implementation. Halcyon would maintain control of its North American distribution network. Nakamura would retain authority over core manufacturing technologies. Major strategic decisions would require approval from a joint council. Neither side would dominate. Both would depend on the other. At 4:58, Chairman Nakamura placed his pen on the memorandum. I have one additional condition. Richard's shoulders tightened. What condition? The chairman looked toward Elias. Mr. Carter must serve on the transition council. Several executives shifted in their chairs. Elias immediately shook his head. I do not believe that would be appropriate. Nakamura asked why. I am an employee in Halcyon's cleaning department. That is your current job. The chairman's gaze remained steady. It is not the full measure of your ability. Richard looked at Elias. He is right. Elias met his eyes. This morning, you did not know my name. Richard did not look away. No, I have passed you in the hallway hundreds of times. I know. No, you know now. The correction landed gently but firmly. Richard nodded. You are right. And because I saved one meeting, you want to place me on a strategic council? Not because you saved a meeting. Richard leaned forward. Because you saw what the rest of us could not. Elias looked around the table. Some faces held admiration. Others held embarrassment. He understood how quickly people changed their behavior after discovering hidden status. Yet respect given only to the impressive was not true respect. A person should not need to speak multiple languages, hold advanced degrees, or rescue a billion-dollar deal before others treated him like a human being. Even if Elias had never lived in Japan, the laughter that morning would still have been wrong. He folded his hands. I will consider the position under one condition. Richard asked, what condition? Halcyon creates a real development program for frontline employees. Richard waited. Cleaning staff, security, maintenance, warehouse workers, cafeteria employees. Elias looked toward the executives. People whose abilities may be invisible because no one has bothered to ask. Richard nodded slowly. What would the program include? Skills assessment, training, internal interviews, mentoring, tuition support where possible. Vanessa began taking notes. Elias continued. And it cannot become a publicity campaign. Richard looked toward Vanessa. She stopped writing. It must have a real budget, Elias said. Real accountability. Real opportunities. Richard extended his hand. Agreed. Elias did not take it yet. One more thing. Richard waited. The purpose cannot be to prove janitors are valuable only when they become managers. Richard's expression softened. Then what is the purpose? To respect people and the jobs they have while also allowing them to pursue the jobs they are capable of doing. The room remained silent. Then Richard nodded. Agreed. Only then did Elias shake his hand. Chairman Nakamura smiled. 6 months on the council, Elias said. After that, we evaluate. The chairman bowed his head. 6 months. When the Japanese delegation finally left, evening light had turned the windows gold. Vanessa waited near the door while the others gathered their belongings. Mr. Carter? Elias turned. I want to apologize. He said nothing. She looked uncomfortable. For the comment I made this morning. Which one? Her face reddened. About your uniform matching the carpet. I remember. I thought. I was being funny. The person making the joke is rarely the best judge of whether it was harmless. Vanessa lowered her eyes. You are right. Elias did not tell her it was fine. It had not been fine. Forgiveness did not require pretending harm had never happened. Next time, he said, think before you join laughter aimed at someone with less power in the room. She nodded. I will. Bradley approached several minutes later. His tie was loosened. His polished confidence was gone. He stopped a few feet from Elias. I owe you an apology. Elias waited. Not only for shouting at you. Bradley took a breath. For the way I have looked at you all these years. How did you look at me? As if you did not matter. And now, Bradley glanced toward the signed memorandum. Now I know you do. Elias shook his head. Bradley frowned. What? You still do not understand. Elias touched the scratch name tag on his uniform. I did not become important when I spoke Japanese. Bradley's expression changed. I was important before that. The words were quiet. They carried more force than anger could have. Bradley stood without speaking. Finally, he nodded. I understand. No, Elias said. Not yet. Bradley looked down. But perhaps you will. The next morning, Elias arrived at 5:30. He wore the same blue uniform. He unlocked the supply closet. Checked the leaking pipe on the 31st floor. Replaced trash bags on 23. Polished the elevator doors on 17. By 8 o'clock, the story had spread through the building. People who had ignored him for years began smiling. Good morning, Mr. Carter. I heard what happened. You were incredible. Some claimed they had always known there was something special about him. Elias accepted the praise without believing it. People often rewrote their memories once the truth became fashionable. At 9, Richard summoned him to the executive office. A contract sat on the desk. The title read, Senior Advisor for Strategic Integration and Organizational Culture. The salary was 6 times what Elias currently earned. The package included a private office, benefits, travel, and a position on the Transition Council. Elias, read every page. Richard waited. Well, there is a problem. Richard's face tightened. What problem? The start date is Monday. Yes. I need 2 weeks. Richard blinked. Why? To train my replacement. The cleaning department can manage. Perhaps. Elias closed the contract. But the floor machine on 19 pulls left. The pipe on 31 leaks every Tuesday morning. Rosa on the night shift needs someone to cover 2 evenings next week because her son is sick. Richard stared at him. You are about to join the executive strategy team, and you are worried about a floor machine? That is one reason I belong on the strategy team. Richard considered the answer. Then he smiled. 2 weeks. Elias signed the contract. Before leaving, he turned back. The employee development program. Richard nodded. Within 30 days. I want to meet every department head. To discuss the program? To ask how many people work under them whose lives and abilities they know nothing about. Richard leaned back in his chair. I suspect the answer will be uncomfortable. The most useful answers usually are. 6 months later, the partnership between Halcyon Dynamics and Nakamura Industries was formally approved. The Nagoya plant became an advanced training and engineering center. Rather than losing workers, it hired 80 young engineers. Halcyon's defect rate dropped 41% during the first year. 2 American plants remained open. More than 6,000 jobs were preserved. The Frontline Development Initiative began with 100 employees. The company discovered that a Syrian security guard had previously worked as an electrical engineer. A cafeteria employee held an accounting degree that had not transferred after immigration. A woman on the night cleaning team had once managed an elementary school in Guatemala. A warehouse worker had been teaching himself software development for 4 years. Not all of them wanted different careers. Some were proud of the work they already did. Elias insisted the company understand that distinction. Opportunity was not the same as rescue. A cleaner did not need to become an executive to prove that cleaning was honorable. Respect could not depend on ambition. Bradley remained at Halcyon, though he no longer led international strategy alone. Richard required him to attend cross-cultural leadership training and spend 3 months rotating through operations. At first, Bradley considered it punishment. Later, he admitted it had been the first education he had received in years. One afternoon, he met Elias inside an elevator. Both men wore suits. Bradley looked different, not smaller, quieter. "I visited Nagoya last week," he said. "How was it?" "I met a technician named Sato. He has worked there 36 years. Elias nodded. "What did you learn?" Bradley thought for a moment. That efficiency is not always about doing something faster or cheaper. The elevator descended. Sometimes, Bradley continued, efficiency means not destroying something that would be impossible to rebuild. A small smile appeared on Elias's face. That is worth remembering. The elevator doors opened. Bradley placed one hand between them as a delivery worker approached carrying 2 heavy boxes. He held the door. The worker stepped inside. "Thank you," the man said. Bradley nodded. Before leaving, he looked at Elias. "I am trying." Elias watched the doors close. Real change usually begins with small choices. 1 year after the disastrous meeting, the Joint Council gathered again in the same boardroom. The walnut table remained. The glass walls remained. Chicago still stretched below the windows. But near the entrance hung a new plaque. It carried one sentence in English and Japanese. Never confuse a person's current position with the full measure of their potential. Elias arrived early. He checked the presentation screen, straightened a chair, moved a water glass away from the edge of the table. A young janitor named Marcus was cleaning the windows. "Mr. Carter," Marcus said, "you know you do not have to straighten the chairs anymore." "Old habit." Marcus smiled. "People tell the story about you all the time. I hope they do not exaggerate. They say you walked into the room, spoke Japanese, and made everyone silent." The truth was less dramatic. "What is the truth?" Elias glanced around. The boardroom. "The truth is that many people were speaking and almost no one was listening." Marcus leaned on the handle of his cleaning tool. "Do you think one meeting really changed the company?" "No." Marcus looked surprised. "No. One meeting cannot change a company." Elias looked toward the plaque. "Neither can one speech. Or one training program. Then what does?" "Small decisions repeated every day." He nodded toward Marcus. "When executives pass you now, do they say hello?" "Most do." "Do they know your name?" "More than before." "Do they ask what you know?" "Sometimes." "Then something has changed." Elias paused. "But not enough." Marcus returned to the window. "Marcus." "Yes." "You are still studying network administration at night?" Marcus looked over his shoulder. "You remembered?" "Yes. I have 2 semesters left. The technology department is opening an internal internship." Marcus froze. "I submitted your name." "Really? You still have to interview." "Of course. No one will hand you the position." "I understand." Elias smiled. "But at least the door will open." Marcus looked down, trying unsuccessfully to hide his emotion. "Thank you. Do not thank me for opening a door that should never have been locked." Later that morning, Chairman Nakamura addressed the council. He spoke in Japanese, though the professional interpreter sat nearby. His eyes remained on Elias. "There is an old story," he said, "about a stone beside a road." Elias translated. "Hundreds of travelers kicked it aside because they believed it was worthless. One day, a craftsman lifted the stone and discovered a rare pattern inside. Everyone listened. The stone eventually became the center of a famous garden." Chairman Nakamura paused. "But the lesson is not that every stone must become a work of art before it deserves value." Elias's voice softened as he translated. "The lesson is that the ignorance of passing travelers never determined the value of the stone." Bradley looked through the glass wall. Marcus was pushing his cart down the hallway. Vanessa looked toward the plaque. Richard looked at Elias. For years, people had passed him without seeing him. Some had ignored him. Some had mocked him. They thought his uniform explained his life. They believed silence meant ignorance. They mistook humility for weakness. They assumed that a man carrying a mop could not understand the conversations taking place around a polished table. Then Elias spoke Japanese. and suddenly they listened. But Japanese had not created his value. His academic background had not created it. His consulting experience had not created it. Those things had merely forced the room to notice a worth that had existed all along. A person's value does not begin when the world discovers his talent. It exists when no one applauds, when no one knows his name, when he stands quietly in the corner with a cloth in his hand. Sometimes, the wisest person in a boardroom is not the one sitting at the head of the table. Sometimes, it is the person cleaning what everyone else has left behind. The one who hears every word but is never asked what he thinks. The one people underestimate so completely that they never imagine he might understand more than they do. Until he speaks. When Elias Carter spoke that morning, he did more than use flawless Japanese. He spoke with experience, with grief, with patience, with the dignity of a man who had lost status without losing himself. The room finally listened. Yet the greatest lesson was never that the black janitor could speak perfect Japanese. It was that they should have respected him even if he could not speak a single word of it. Dui de la fan teep noi tu nin qua ka chuyen. Jung Nguyen van Fong tu Thiet va Noi Teep Nai, Sao Don Ket Truoc. The applause faded slowly. Not because the room had been instructed to stop, but because no one wanted to be the first person to break the silence that followed Chairman Nakamura's final words. Outside, Chicago glowed beneath the amber light of early evening. The city looked unchanged. Inside the boardroom, however, something fundamental had shifted. People gathered their notebooks and laptops. Yet conversations moved more slowly than usual. Executives who normally rushed toward the next meeting lingered by the windows. Several exchanged quiet remarks with Marcus before leaving, asking about his studies and wishing him luck in his upcoming internship interview. It was a small gesture. A year earlier, none of them would have remembered his name. Elias waited until nearly everyone had left before collecting his own notes. He had never enjoyed attention. Recognition was pleasant, but it was also distracting. Too many people confused admiration with understanding. They assumed that once someone became respected, the lesson had been learned forever. Experience had taught Elias otherwise. People changed. Organizations changed. Then, slowly, they drifted back toward old habits unless someone reminded them why those habits had been broken in the first place. As he slipped his notebook into a leather briefcase, Richard approached him. "I've been meaning to ask you something." Elias smiled. "You usually do." Richard laughed softly. "Fair enough." They walked together toward the hallway overlooking the city. "When I first hired you," Richard began before stopping himself. Elias raised an eyebrow. "You didn't hire me." Richard nodded. "You're right. Human resources did." He looked out the window. "But I approved every department budget, every staffing plan, every restructuring proposal." His reflection stared back at him through the glass. "I used to believe leadership meant seeing the whole organization." He paused. "The truth is, I never really saw it at all." Elias remained quiet. Richard continued. "I knew revenue. I knew margins. I knew production targets. I knew shareholder expectations. But I didn't know the people carrying those numbers." For several moments, only the faint hum of the building filled the silence. Richard finally turned toward him. "Do you know what surprised me most?" "What?" "It wasn't your Japanese. It wasn't your resume. It wasn't even your ideas." Elias waited. Richard smiled. "It was that after everything that happened, you never tried to make anyone feel smaller." Elias looked toward the conference room. "I've known what it feels like to be treated as if I didn't matter." He folded his hands behind his back. "Why would I want someone else to experience the same thing?" Richard nodded slowly. "I don't know if I could have done that." "You could." "You really think so?" "I think every person has the ability to become kinder." He smiled faintly. "The difficult part is deciding to." A few days later, Halcyon's employee development program welcomed its second class. More than 600 employees applied. Not because they all wanted promotions. Many simply wanted someone to ask about the skills they had never been given an opportunity to use. One warehouse supervisor revealed that he had spent years designing inventory software in his spare time. A receptionist spoke fluent Mandarin and Korean after growing up overseas. A maintenance technician had invented a small safety device that reduced equipment downtime by nearly 20%, but had never told anyone because he assumed no executive would care. Elias insisted every applicant be interviewed, not evaluated. Interviewed. There was a difference. Evaluations searched for deficiencies. Conversation discovered potential. The program soon became one of the company's most successful initiatives. Business schools requested case studies. Leadership conferences invited Richard to speak. Journalists asked what inspired the transformation. Whenever they praised Halcyon for creating an innovative culture, Richard always answered the same way. We didn't invent anything. We simply started paying attention to people who had always been there. Months later, Bradley stood before a room of newly promoted managers. Part of his responsibility now included leadership training. The irony wasn't lost on him. He looked across the audience before speaking. I used to believe authority earned respect. He shook his head. I had it backward. He walked away from the podium and stood among the audience instead. Respect isn't something your position demands. It's something your character deserves. Someone raised a hand. What changed your mind? Bradley smiled. I once spent 7 years walking past the smartest person in my building. The audience laughed softly. I never noticed him. The laughter disappeared. That failure still embarrasses me. He looked around the room. So here's my advice. When someone in this company speaks, he paused. Listen before deciding whether their title makes their opinion important. Across the city, Marcus completed his internship interview. 2 weeks later, he received an email offering him a junior position on Halcyon's cybersecurity team. He immediately walked downstairs to Elias's office. I got it. I heard. You already knew? Elias smiled. I received the same email. Marcus laughed. I wanted to tell you first. You just did. Marcus hesitated. I've been thinking about something. What is it? If nobody had asked about my studies. He looked down. I'd probably still believe they didn't matter. Elias leaned back in his chair. Never let other people's assumptions become your own limits. Marcus nodded. I won't. And one more thing. Yes. When you become a senior engineer one day. Marcus laughed. I hope so. Don't forget to learn the names of the people cleaning your office. Marcus's smile faded into something more thoughtful. I won't. I promise. Years passed. Halcyon and Nakamura became one of the strongest strategic partnerships in the industry. Analysts credited manufacturing efficiency. Shareholders praised disciplined investment. Consultants admired cross-cultural leadership. Only a handful of people knew the entire story. Only a handful remembered that the partnership had nearly collapsed before it truly began. Not because of financial disagreements. Not because of technology. Not because of competition. But because a room full of accomplished people had forgotten one of the simplest truths in business. Every person has a story you cannot see. Ignore that story, and sooner or later, you'll make decisions based on assumptions instead of understanding. Listen to that story, and you may discover that the person you almost overlooked is the very one capable of changing everything. Teep Noi Kachian. Nearly 3 years after that unforgettable morning, Halcyon Dynamics had become a case study taught in graduate business schools across the United States. Professors analyzed the merger. Financial experts praised the turnaround. Industry analysts highlighted the dramatic improvement in manufacturing quality. Articles credited visionary leadership, bold restructuring, and cross-cultural collaboration. Almost none of them mentioned the janitor. That never bothered Elias. He had never cared about becoming the face of the company's success. In fact, he quietly declined several television interviews. When one national business magazine insisted on featuring him as the janitor who saved a billion-dollar deal, he politely refused. The editor called personally. Mr. Carter, your story could inspire millions. Elias smiled. Then tell the right story. We intend to. No. He shook his head, even though the editor couldn't see him. You intend to tell a story about an extraordinary janitor. And that's true, isn't it? Not exactly. The editor hesitated. What do you mean? If people finish reading your article believing the lesson is that every janitor might secretly be a former professor. He paused. Then they've learned nothing. The editor remained silent. The real lesson, Elias continued, is that nobody should have to prove they're extraordinary before they're treated with ordinary respect. Those words never appeared in print. Instead, the magazine ran another headline. The man who spoke perfect Japanese. It sold thousands of copies. Elias clipped the article anyway. Not because he liked it. Because one day he wanted to show Marcus how easily the world could miss the point. Marcus flourished in the cybersecurity department. Within 2 years, he had become one of the company's most promising young engineers. He was intelligent, disciplined, curious. But what impressed Elias most had nothing to do with technology. Every Friday afternoon, Marcus walked through the maintenance department before going home. He greeted every cleaner, every security guard, every cafeteria employee. He knew their birthdays. He knew whose daughter had started college, whose father was recovering from surgery, whose wife had opened a small bakery. One afternoon, another engineer laughed. "You know everybody." Marcus shrugged. "I try." "Why?" Marcus smiled. "Because someone once remembered my dream before I believed anyone else would." Not everyone welcomed the cultural changes. Some executives privately complained that Halcyon's leadership programs had become too emotional. One board member argued that managers spent too much time discussing people and not enough time discussing profit. Richard listened patiently. Then he projected a single graph onto the conference room screen. Employee turnover had dropped 36%. Productivity had risen. Customer satisfaction had reached the highest level in company history. Innovation proposals from frontline employees had increased nearly 400%. He looked around the room. Would anyone like to explain which part of respecting people is hurting the business? No one answered. The discussion ended there. Late one evening, after most employees had gone home, Elias walked through the executive floor. Old habits never completely disappeared. Sometimes he still straightened a crooked chair. Sometimes he picked up a coffee cup someone had forgotten. Not because it was his job anymore, because disorder had always bothered him. As he passed the old boardroom, he noticed the lights were still on. Inside sat Chairman Hiroshi Nakamura. Alone, he was looking out across the Chicago skyline. Elias stepped inside. "I thought your flight left an hour ago." Nakamura smiled. "I postponed it. For work. For reflection." Elias sat across from him. For several minutes, neither man spoke. Finally, Nakamura broke the silence. "Do you know what my father taught me when I was young?" Elias shook his head. He owned a tiny machine shop. The chairman looked at his hands. "He told me, whenever you visit a factory, greet the receptionist first." Elias listened. "Then greet the people cleaning the floors. Only afterward should you greet the executives." "Why?" Elias asked. Nakamura smiled softly. "My father said, if the first two groups seem afraid to speak honestly, then it doesn't matter how impressive the executives appear." The room became quiet again. "My father believed fear always travels upward." Elias nodded slowly. "Wise man. He never finished high school. Wisdom rarely asks for diplomas." The chairman laughed. "You remind me of him." "Then I should. Take that as the highest compliment." "You should." That winter, Halcyon hosted its annual holiday gathering. Unlike previous years, there was no executive-only reception, no separate dining room, no reserved elevators. Every employee, from interns to board members, shared the same ballroom. Richard insisted on one new tradition. Instead of inviting celebrity speakers, each year one employee would tell a personal story, not about business, about life. The first speaker was Rosa, the night shift cleaner Elias had once mentioned. Many executives had never spoken to her before. They learned she had immigrated with 2 children, worked nights for 12 years, and spent every afternoon helping local students learn English at the community center. When she finished speaking, the ballroom stood in applause. Not because she had overcome impossible odds. Not because she had secretly founded a company. Not because she possessed hidden genius. Simply because everyone finally knew her. As the applause faded, Richard leaned toward Elias. "You were right." "About what?" "People don't become valuable after we discover their stories." He watched Rosa laughing with coworkers. "We simply become aware of value that was already there." Elias smiled. "It took you a while." Richard chuckled. "It did. But I suppose learning is another word for changing." "And changing," Elias replied, "is another word for listening." Richard looked around the ballroom. Employees from every department were talking together. Engineers laughed with cleaners. Executives chatted with warehouse staff. Security officers shared desserts with software developers. It wasn't a perfect company. It never would be. Conflicts still happened. Mistakes were still made. Deadlines were still missed. But something invisible had changed. People no longer walked past one another as if some lives mattered more than others. Not because everyone had become kind overnight. Because enough people had chosen, one conversation at a time, to see the human being before seeing the job title. And in the end, Elias realized that was worth far more than saving a billion-dollar deal. The deal had protected thousands of jobs. But the Lesson had protected something even more valuable, the dignity of the people doing them. 5 years after the morning that changed halcyon dynamics, Elias received a letter from Kyoto. It arrived in a cream-colored envelope with his name written by hand. Not printed, not typed, written carefully in dark blue ink. He recognized the handwriting before he opened it. It belonged to Professor Masaru Takeda, his former department chair at Kyoto University. Elias sat alone in his office for several minutes before breaking the seal. The letter was brief. Professor Takeda was retiring. The university was organizing a final symposium on leadership, industrial culture, and the future of ethical management. He wanted Elias to deliver the closing lecture. At the bottom of the page, beneath his signature, Takeda had added one handwritten sentence. You left before your students had the chance to say goodbye. Perhaps it is time to return. Elias read that line 3 times. Then he folded the letter and placed it beside the photograph on his desk. The photograph showed him and his wife, Margaret, standing beneath cherry blossoms beside the philosopher's path in Kyoto. They were both younger. Margaret was laughing at something outside the frame. Elias was looking at her instead of the camera. For years, he had avoided returning to Japan. He told himself the reason was work, then money, then timing. But the truth was simpler. Japan contained too many versions of the life he had lost. The apartment they had shared, the small coffee shop Margaret loved, the train station where she always bought sweet bean cakes for the journey home, the hospital where a doctor first suggested they return to America. Going back meant walking into memories that had remained untouched for years. He had learned to carry grief. He was not certain he wanted to disturb it. There was a soft knock on his office door. Richard stepped inside. Am I interrupting? Elias folded the letter. No, Richard noticed the envelope. Good news. I have been invited to speak in Kyoto. Richard's face brightened. That is wonderful. I have not accepted. Why not? Elias looked at the photograph. Richard followed his gaze. Understanding appeared slowly. You have not been back since Margaret died. No, Richard sat across from him. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Richard said, You once told me that locked doors exist even when other people cannot see them. Elias looked at him. Sometimes grief is a locked door too. Elias smiled faintly. You have become unexpectedly philosophical. I have had a good teacher. Richard leaned forward. I cannot tell you whether to go. He paused. But I know what happens when fear disguises itself as practicality. Elias looked again at the letter. The invitation was not merely to give a lecture. It was an invitation to meet the man he had once been, and perhaps to discover whether that man still existed. 3 weeks later, Elias accepted. The news spread quickly through Halcyon. Marcus asked to attend. Bradley volunteered to travel as part of the company delegation. Richard arranged for Halcyon to sponsor several young employees from the leadership program. Chairman Nakamura offered to host them in Tokyo before the symposium. What began as one invitation became a journey for 12 people. Yet Elias knew the most difficult part of the trip would be faced alone. When the plane descended over Osaka, he looked through the window at the coastline below. Memories rose before the city became visible. Margaret standing beside a vending machine, laughing because she had bought hot soup instead of tea. Margaret practicing Japanese honorifics in their kitchen. Margaret asleep against the train window on the way to Nara. For one painful moment, Elias considered remaining on the plane when it landed. Then he heard Marcus behind him. Mr. Carter, are you all right? Elias turned. Marcus was no longer the uncertain young cleaner he had once known. He was now a cybersecurity team leader, wearing a navy blazer and carrying a company badge that identified him as part of Halcyon's international technology group. But concern in his eyes remained the same. I am fine, Elias said. Marcus smiled. That usually means the opposite. Elias laughed quietly. You have been spending too much time around executives. I learned from the best. The group traveled from Osaka to Kyoto by train. As the landscape moved past the windows, Bradley sat across from Elias. He had changed during the years since the disastrous meeting. Not completely. No one changed completely. He still liked expensive suits. Still spoke too quickly when nervous. Still enjoyed winning arguments. But he had learned to recognize those habits before they controlled him. Were you happy here? Bradley asked. Elias looked outside. Very. Then why does returning look so painful? Because happiness leaves a shape behind when it disappears. Bradley absorbed the answer. I used to think grief meant remembering the bad ending. Elias shook his head. Most grief comes from remembering the good beginning. Kyoto welcomed them with cool spring rain. The streets shone beneath paper lanterns. Temple roofs rose above narrow alleys. The air smelled of wet stone, cedar, and distant cooking fires. Professor Takeda waited at the university entrance. He was 81 now, smaller than Elias remembered, with silver hair and a cane in one hand. When he saw Elias, he stopped walking. Neither man spoke. Then Takeda placed his cane aside and embraced him. The gesture surprised everyone. Japanese formalities disappeared. For several seconds, they were not former colleagues. They were two old friends reunited after too much time. You became difficult to find, Takeda said in Japanese. I was not hiding very well. You were hiding extremely well. You became a janitor in Chicago. Elias laughed. So you heard the story. Everyone heard the story. Takeda stepped back and examined him. But I suspect most people heard the wrong one. Elias smiled. You know me too well. The symposium took place 2 days later. Scholars, executives, engineers, students, and former colleagues filled the university auditorium. The program listed Elias as Dr. Elias N. Carter Senior Advisor, Halcyon. Nakamura, Alliance former visiting associate professor. Kyoto University. Elias stared at the title before walking on stage. It felt accurate and incomplete. He stood behind the podium while the applause settled. Then he looked at the audience. When people invited me here, he began. In Japanese, they expected me to speak about cultural intelligence, negotiation, and strategic leadership. A few people smiled. I will discuss those things. He paused. But first, I want to speak about cleaning floors. The room grew quiet. Elias told them about his first week at Sterling Apex Tower. How he had learned which elevators executives used. Which offices required fragrance-free cleaning products. Which department stayed latest. Which managers left coffee cups on desks, and which ones carried them to the kitchen. He described how invisible workers learned the true character of an organization. Not from mission statements. From behavior. A company may publish beautiful values, he said, but the cleaning staff knows whether those values are real. He moved away from the podium. They know which leaders greet people. They know who creates messes and expects someone else to remove them. They know who apologizes. They know who assumes service means inferiority. The auditorium remained silent. At Halcyon, the most important change did not occur when a partnership was signed. It occurred when people began asking a new question. Elias looked toward Marcus, seated near the front. Instead of asking, "What is your position?" they began asking, "What knowledge are we failing to see?" He spoke about Nagoya, about the technicians who had nearly been reduced to numbers in a cost-saving plan, about the security officer who had once been an engineer, about Rosa, who taught English after working all night, about Marcus, who studied cybersecurity while cleaning executive offices. Then he looked toward Bradley. And I learned something else. The people who cause harm are not always monsters. Bradley lowered his eyes. Sometimes they are ordinary people who have been rewarded for never examining their assumptions. Elias allowed the words to settle. That does not excuse the harm, but it means transformation is possible. Bradley looked up. Their eyes met. Elias continued. Real leadership is not proven by having the correct answer before anyone else. It is proven by whether the truth can reach you from someone with less status. A student near the front began taking notes rapidly. Elias smiled. Do not write too fast. A wave of laughter moved through the room. The most dangerous room is not one without intelligent people. It is one where intelligence is allowed to travel in only one direction. The laughter disappeared. Elias returned to the podium. Years ago, people laughed at me in a boardroom. They stopped laughing when I spoke Japanese. He looked across the auditorium. For a long time, others treated that moment as the beginning of my value. It was not. My value did not begin when they became aware of it. Neither does yours. He paused. Neither does the value of the person who serves your food, cleans your office, carries your luggage, answers your phone, repairs your equipment, or stands silently while you speak. The auditorium was completely still. The greatest failure of prejudice is not that it occasionally overlooks an extraordinary person. It is that it convinces us ordinary people must prove they are extraordinary before we grant them dignity. In the front row, Professor Takeda lowered his head. Elias finished in Japanese. A wise organization does not wait for the janitor to speak perfect Japanese before deciding to listen. It listens because he is human. For several seconds, no one moved. Then Professor Takeda stood, slowly, leaning on his cane. The audience rose with him. The applause began quietly before filling the hall. Elias looked toward the lights above the stage. He had received standing ovations before, in lecture halls, at conferences, during his years as a professor. But this one felt different. Not because it was louder, because he had returned without trying to become the man he used to be. He had arrived as the man his entire life had shaped. After the symposium, former students surrounded him. Some were now executives, some professors, some engineers. One woman approached with tears in her eyes. "My father worked at the factory your restructuring program saved," she said. Elias listened. He kept his job until retirement. She bowed deeply. "I was able to attend university because he continued working." Elias struggled to answer. For years, he had believed that part of his career had vanished without leaving a trace. Now, standing beneath the university's old stone archway, he saw evidence that work could continue living in people long after one had forgotten it. That evening, Elias left the hotel alone. He walked through the rain toward the neighborhood where he and Margaret had lived. The apartment building was still there. The ground floor florist had become a small pharmacy. The bakery across the street had changed owners. But the narrow staircase remained. So did the balcony where Margaret used to hang laundry on bright mornings. Elias stood across the street for a long time. He did not go inside. He did not need to. Instead, he walked toward the philosopher's path. The rain had stopped. Cherry blossoms floated in the canal like pale fragments of memory. He reached the place where the photograph on his desk had been taken. For years, he had imagined returning there would break something inside him. It did not. Grief was present, but so was gratitude. He sat on a bench and took the photograph from his coat pocket. "Margaret," he whispered. The name felt both familiar and impossible. "I came back." A breeze moved through the branches. Petals fell across his shoulders. Elias closed his eyes. He remembered her final weeks. The hospital room, the machines, the exhaustion. But slowly, other memories returned. Her laughter in the kitchen, the warmth of her hand, the way she mispronounced Japanese station names, the old blue bicycle she refused to replace. For years, illness had dominated the ending of her story. That evening, Elias allowed love to reclaim the beginning. He sat until the path grew dark. When he returned to the hotel, Marcus was waiting in the lobby. He did not ask where Elias had been. He only handed him a cup of tea. Elias accepted it. "Thank you." Marcus sat beside him. After a while, Elias said, "You kept your promise." "What promise?" "You learned the names of the people cleaning your office." Marcus smiled. "All of them. Good. I also made a mistake last month." Elias looked at him. "One of our interns raised a security concern during a meeting. I dismissed it because he was new." "What happened?" "He was right." Marcus looked embarrassed. "I apologized. And I changed the review process so junior staff can raise concerns anonymously if necessary." Elias nodded. "Then you learned." "I still felt terrible." "You should." Marcus looked surprised. Elias smiled. "Guilt is useful when it becomes responsibility." He sipped the tea. "It becomes useless when it becomes self-punishment." Marcus leaned back. "Does becoming wise ever mean you stop making mistakes?" "No, what does it mean, then?" "You become quicker to recognize them and less interested in defending them." Marcus absorbed the answer. "Mr. Carter?" "Yes." "Will you ever retire?" Elias looked toward the hotel windows. Kyoto's lights shimmered in the wet streets. "Eventually." "What will you do?" "I have been thinking about teaching again." Marcus smiled. "Here. Perhaps sometimes." "In Chicago?" "Chicago, too." He looked at Marcus. Classrooms are not always inside universities. The following year, Elias established the Carter Center for Human-Centered Leadership. It began with one room inside Halcyon's training division. There was no marble entrance, no expensive branding, no dramatic mission statement. The first program brought together 24 participants, executives, factory technicians, cleaners, engineers, security officers, managers, receptionists. They sat in a circle without nameplates showing titles. Each person had to introduce someone else after listening to that person's life story for 30 minutes. At first, the executives were uncomfortable. They were accustomed to presenting themselves, not listening long enough to present another person accurately. By the end of the day, several were in tears. The program expanded. Other companies requested workshops. Universities developed partnerships. Nakamura funded a second center in Nagoya. Professor Takeda joined as honorary advisor. Richard served on the board but refused the chairmanship. That position belongs to Elias, he said. Elias refused too. The chair should rotate. Richard laughed. You still enjoy making leadership complicated. No, Elias replied. I enjoy preventing it from becoming comfortable. Bradley became one of the center's most effective speakers. He never softened the story of what he had done. He told audiences how he mocked Elias, how he insulted the Japanese delegation, how he mistook confidence for competence. At one event, someone asked why he was willing to tell such an embarrassing story publicly. Bradley answered, because shame hidden becomes self-protection. He looked toward Elias. Shame examined can become change. Years later, Richard retired from Halcyon Dynamics. At his farewell gathering, employees filled the main atrium. There were speeches, photographs, a video reviewing the company's recovery. When Richard stepped to the microphone, he thanked the board, shareholders, partners, and employees. Then he looked toward Elias. I spent most of my career believing the chief executive was responsible for seeing everything. He smiled. I retired after learning that the most important task of a leader is creating a place where others can show you what you cannot see. He left the stage to prolonged applause. Bradley eventually became CEO. The announcement surprised many people. Not because he lacked intelligence, because everyone remembered the man he had once been. Before accepting the position, Bradley visited Elias. Do you think I deserve it? He asked. Elias considered the question. Wrong question. Bradley sighed. You always say that. Because you continue asking wrong questions. What should I ask? Whether you are prepared to carry the responsibility. Bradley sat across from him. Am I? I do not know. That is reassuring. Elias smiled. The version of you I met in the boardroom was not ready. Bradley nodded. The version sitting here today understands that. Is that enough? No, Elias leaned forward. But it is necessary. Bradley accepted the role. On his first day, he arrived before sunrise. The cleaning crew was finishing the executive floor. He greeted each person, not performatively, not because anyone was watching. He asked one cleaner how long she had worked there. He asked another about the certification course listed on the book beside her cart. Then he walked into the boardroom. The plaque near the entrance remained. Never confuse a person's current position with the full measure of their potential. Bradley stood before it. He remembered the laughter, the arrogance, the moment Elias turned and answered Chairman Nakamura in perfect Japanese. For years, he had believed that was the most important moment of his life. Now he understood it was the moment after. The moment Elias chose not to humiliate him. The moment he was offered the possibility of becoming different. Bradley touched the back of one chair, then straightened it before taking his place at the table. Elias continued teaching into his 70s. He divided his time between Chicago, Nagoya, and Kyoto. He never became wealthy by corporate standards. He never sought celebrity. He carried the scratched blue name tag from his janitorial uniform inside his briefcase. Whenever someone introduced him with too many honors, he placed it on the podium. It reminded him of who he had been. More importantly, it reminded the audience of who they might still be failing to see. At the end of each lecture, Elias asked the same question. Who works near you every day whose story you do not know? He never allowed people to answer immediately. He made them sit with the silence. Because names came slowly. The night guard, the cafeteria worker, the elderly receptionist, the intern who rarely spoke, the cleaner who arrived after everyone else had gone home. Then Elias asked a second question. What has your organization lost because no one thought to listen? That question was harder. It required people to acknowledge that hidden talent was not merely unfortunate. It was costly. Ideas were lost. Warnings ignored. Trust weakened. Human beings reduced to functions. And finally he asked, what will you do differently tomorrow? Not someday. Not after another training program. Tomorrow. Because dignity was not a philosophy until it became behavior. It existed in greetings, in eye contact, in interruptions resisted, in credit shared, in apologies offered without excuses, in names remembered, in doors opened, in questions asked sincerely, in the willingness to listen before a person proved they were useful. Many years after the original meeting, Elias returned once more to the 42nd floor boardroom. He was 82. His hair was completely white now. He walked with a wooden cane Professor Takeda had given him shortly before passing away. Halcyon was hosting a group of high school students from disadvantaged communities. They had come to learn about technology careers, international business, and leadership. Marcus, now Chief Information Security Officer, introduced Elias. But before he could list his accomplishments, Elias raised a hand. "That is enough." The students laughed. Elias sat at the table rather than standing at the front. A girl near the window studied him. "Is it true you saved the company because you spoke Japanese?" Elias smiled. "That is how people like to tell it." "But did you?" "I helped." She waited. "What is the real story?" Elias looked around the room. Some details had changed. The screen was newer. The chairs more modern. The city below had grown. But the light fell across the table exactly as it had that winter morning decades earlier. "The real story," he said, "is that a group of intelligent people almost destroyed something important because they were too proud to listen." The students became quiet. "And then you spoke Japanese?" "Yes." Was everyone shocked? "Very." A boy near the end of the table asked. "Did that feel good?" Elias considered the question. "For a moment." Only a moment. Their surprise proved they had underestimated me. He tapped the cane lightly against the floor. "But being underestimated is not victory." "What is?" "Helping people become better than the assumptions they once held." The girl near the window looked at his old name tag resting on the table. "Why do you still carry that?" Elias picked it up. "Because people treated me differently when I wore it. They thought you were less important." "Yes. But you were the same person." "Exactly." She looked around the boardroom. "That is stupid." Elias laughed. "It is." The students laughed with him. Then he leaned back. "But most prejudice looks stupid after someone explains it clearly." He let the silence return. "The challenge is recognizing it while everyone still thinks it is normal." Before the students left, Elias asked them to write one sentence on cards. "A person I will no longer overlook is." The answers were anonymous. A bus driver, a younger brother, a grandmother, a quiet classmate, a father who worked nights, a teacher everyone mocked. One card simply said, "Myself." Elias held that card longer than the others. Then he placed it in his pocket. After the group left, he remained alone in the boardroom. Snow had begun falling over Chicago, just as it had on the morning Chairman Nakamura first arrived. Elias walked slowly toward the corner where his cleaning cart had once stood. He could almost see his younger self. Blue uniform, folded cloth, eyes lowered, listening while powerful people discussed the future as if no one else in the room understood. He remembered Vanessa's joke, Bradley's laughter, Richard's impatience, the mistranslated slide, the puddle near the door, Chairman Nakamura's words. "A person's character is revealed by how they treat those in a weaker position." And he remembered his own answer. Appearing weak and being weak are not the same thing. Elias smiled. At the time, everyone believed his perfect Japanese was the surprise. It was not. The real surprise was how much wisdom could stand quietly in a room while arrogance spoke over it. How much experience could be hidden beneath a uniform. How much dignity could survive years of disrespect. How much a company could change after one person finally decided to listen. He turned off the boardroom lights. Before stepping into the hallway, he looked once more at the plaque beside the door. Then he removed the old name tag from his pocket and placed it beneath the words. Not as a monument, not as evidence of humiliation, as a reminder that titles reveal responsibility, not worth. That clothing reveals occupation, not intelligence. That silence reveals restraint, not emptiness. That hardship can change a person's circumstances without reducing their humanity. And that no room is truly intelligent when only powerful voices are heard. Elias closed the door behind him. The next morning, a young cleaner found the name tag. She read it carefully. Elias Carter. She recognized the name from the company's training center, but she did not know the entire story. Beside the plaque lay a small handwritten note. She picked it up. The message contained only 2 lines. You do not have to amaze people to deserve their respect, and you do not have to wait for permission to know your own worth. The cleaner read the note again. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in her pocket. Outside the windows, Chicago awakened beneath the snow. Employees began arriving. Elevators opened. Lights appeared across the building. Meetings were prepared. Coffee was poured. Floors were cleaned. A company continued its work. And somewhere inside that ordinary morning, Another person who had once felt invisible stood a little straighter. That was Elias Carter's true legacy. Not the Japanese he spoke. Not the billion-dollar agreement he helped save. Not the title he eventually held. His legacy was the question he left behind in every room. Who are we failing to see? And for those courageous enough to answer it honestly, nothing ever looked quite the same again. Several months after Elias's final lecture, the handwritten note disappeared from beneath the plaque. No one reported it missing. No security camera ever revealed who had taken it. For a while, people wondered whether someone had stolen it as a souvenir. Then, one quiet Monday morning, Marcus discovered another handwritten note in exactly the same place. It was written in different handwriting. It read, "I was the cleaner who found Mr. Carter's note. Today I start my first day as a junior systems analyst. Someone listened to me before I had anything impressive to prove. Thank you." Marcus smiled. He folded the note carefully and placed it inside a small glass frame beside the plaque. Soon another note appeared. Then another. Years passed. The boardroom became famous, not because of the billion-dollar agreement that had saved Halcyon Dynamics, but because of the tradition that quietly grew beside its door. Employees who changed careers. Interns who found mentors. Managers who admitted mistakes. Engineers who finally listened to technicians. Executives who apologized. Security guards who earned promotions. Receptionists who became project coordinators. Warehouse workers who invented better systems. One by one, they left anonymous notes, not celebrating themselves, remembering the people who had chosen to see them. Eventually, visitors began asking about the collection. Who started this tradition? Marcus would simply smile. It started with a man who reminded us that every title tells you what someone does. He would pause. It never tells you who they are. Decades later, after Elias Carter had quietly passed away at the age of 91, Halcyon closed its offices for 1 hour. Production lines paused. Conference calls ended early. Factory machines fell silent. Not because company policy required it, because employees requested it. No grand memorial service was held in the executive auditorium. That would not have suited him. Instead, people gathered in the places where everyday work happened. In factories, warehouses, reception areas, security offices, maintenance workshops, break rooms, and, of course, beside the old boardroom on the 42nd floor. The scratched blue name tag still rested beneath the plaque. It had faded with time. The plastic was cracked. The letters were barely visible. No one replaced it. Perfection had never been the point. Late that afternoon, Marcus stood alone in the boardroom. He was no longer a young engineer. His own hair had begun turning gray. On the conference table lay a simple envelope addressed to future employees. Inside was a letter Elias had written years earlier, with instructions that it be opened only after his death. Marcus unfolded the pages. The room was silent. The letter read, "If you are reading this, then I am no longer walking these hallways. That is all right. Buildings do not remember people. People remember people. If this company has remained kind, it will not be because of anything I said. It will be because thousands of ordinary choices were made by ordinary people. Someone chose to say good morning. Someone chose to ask a question instead of making an assumption. Someone chose to listen before speaking. Someone chose to apologize without defending themselves. Someone chose to open a door instead of walking through it alone. Never wait for another extraordinary story before deciding to respect the person standing in front of you. Most lives will never become headlines. They do not need to. Dignity is not earned through achievement. It belongs to every person long before the world notices them. If you remember only one thing from my life, let it be this. The next person you overlook may never speak perfect Japanese. They may never rescue a billion-dollar negotiation. They may never become famous. Treat them with respect anyway, because that is not a gift you give them. It is a reflection of who you choose to be. Marcus folded the letter with trembling hands. He looked through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Snow was falling once again over Chicago, just as it had on the morning when a quiet janitor had walked into a boardroom carrying nothing more than a cleaning cloth. History would remember the deal. Business schools would remember the strategy. Executives would remember the negotiation. But the people who truly understood the story remembered something else. A smile offered without expectation. A greeting given without calculation. A question asked with genuine curiosity. The courage to admit, I was wrong. and the quiet strength of a man who never measured another person's worth by the clothes they wore, the title on their business card, or the job they performed. Long after Elias Carter was gone, his voice continued to echo through every hallway where someone paused before making an assumption. Every boardroom where the quietest person was finally invited to speak. Every workplace where a name became more important than a title. And every heart that learned the simplest lesson of all. The greatest measure of success is not how high you rise. It is how deeply you recognize the humanity in those walking beside you. The end.